Thing shows Lacan's discussion of the thing constitutes one of the central themes in the seminar of 1959-1960, where he uses the French term la chose interchangeably with the German term das Ding. There are two main contexts in which this term operates. One, the context of Freud's distinction between word presentations, Wortvorstellungen, and thing presentations, Sachvorstellungen. This distinction is prominent in Freud's metapsychological writings, in which he argues that the two types of presentation are bound together in the preconscious-conscious system, whereas in the unconscious system only thing presentations are found. This seemed to some of Lacan's contemporaries to offer an objection to Lacan's theories about the linguistic nature of the unconscious. Lacan counters such objections by pointing out that there are two words in German for thing, das Ding and die Sache. It is the latter term which Freud usually employs to refer to the thing presentations in the unconscious, and Lacan argues that although on one level Sachvorstellungen and Wortvorstellungen are opposed on the symbolic level, they go together. Thus, die Sache is the representation of a thing in the symbolic order as opposed to das Ding, which is the thing in its dumb reality. The thing in the real, which is the beyond of the signified. The thing presentations found in the unconscious are thus the linguistic phenomena as opposed to das Ding, which is entirely outside language and outside the unconscious. The thing is characterized by the fact that it is impossible for us to imagine it. Lacan's concept of the thing as an unknowable X beyond symbolization has clear affinities with the Kantian thing in itself. 2. The context of jouissance, as well as the object of language, das Ding is the object of desire. It is the lost object which must be continually refound. It is the prehistoric, unforgettable big other. In other words, the forbidden object of incestuous desire, the mother. The pleasure principle is the law which maintains the subject at a certain distance from the thing, making the subject circle around it without ever attaining it. The thing is thus presented to the subject as his sovereign good, but if the subject transgresses the pleasure principle and attains this good, it is experienced as suffering, evil. Lacan plays on the French term mal, which can mean both suffering and evil. Because the subject cannot stand the extreme good that das Ding may bring to him, it is fortunate then that the thing is usually inaccessible. After the seminar of 1959-1960, the term das Ding disappears almost entirely from Lacan's work. However, the ideas associated with it provide the essential features of the new developments in the concept of the objet petit as Lacan develops it from 1963 onwards. For example, the objet petit is circled by the drive and is seen as the cause of desire, just as das Ding is seen as the cause of the most fundamental human passion. Also, the fact that the thing is not the imaginary object but firmly in the register of the real, and yet is that which in the real suffers from the signifier, anticipates the transition in Lacan's thought towards locating objet petit increasingly in the register of the real from 1963 on. Time, temps. One of the most distinctive features of Lacanian psychoanalysis is Lacan's approach to questions of time. Broadly speaking, Lacan's approach is characterized by two important innovations: the concept of logical time and the stress on retroaction and anticipation. Logical time. In his paper entitled Logical Time, Lacan undermines the pretensions of logic to timelessness and eternity by showing how certain logical calculations include an inescapable reference to a temporality. However, the kind of temporality involved is not specifiable by reference to the clock, but is itself the product of certain logical articulations. This distinction between logical time and chronological time underpins Lacan's whole theory of temporality. The fact that logical time is not objective does not mean that it is simply a question of subjective feeling. On the contrary, as the adjective logical indicates, it is a precise dialectical structure which may be formulated rigorously in mathematical terms. In the 1945 paper, Lacan argues that logical time has a tripartite structure, the three moments of which are 1. The instant of seeing, 2. The time for understanding, 3. The moment of concluding. By means of a sophism, the problem of the three prisoners, Lacan shows how these three moments are constructed not in terms of objective chronometric units, but in terms of an intersubjective logic based on a tension between waiting and haste, between hesitation and urgency. Logical time is thus the intersubjective time that structures human action. Lacan's notion of logical time is not just an exercise in logic, it also has practical consequences for psychoanalytic treatment. The most famous of these consequences, historically speaking, has been Lacan's use of sessions of variable duration, séances scandées, which was regarded by the International Psychoanalytical Association (IPA) as sufficient grounds for excluding him from membership. However, to focus exclusively on this particular practice is to miss various other interesting clinical dimensions of the theory of logical time, such as the way in which Lacan's concept of the time for understanding can throw light on the Freudian concept of working through. See Forrester. Lacan's concept of logical time anticipates his incursions into Saussurean linguistics, which is based on the distinction between the diachronic or temporal and the synchronic atemporal aspects of language. Hence Lacan's increasing stress, beginning in the 1950s, on synchronic or timeless structures rather than on developmental stages. Thus, when Lacan uses the term time, it is usually to be understood not as a fleeting diachronic moment, but as a structure, a relatively stable synchronic state. Similarly, when he speaks of the three times of the Oedipus complex, the ordering is one of logical priority rather than of a chronological sequence. Change is not seen as a gradual or smooth move along a continuum, but as an abrupt shift from one discrete structure to another. Lacan's emphasis on synchronic or timeless structures can be seen as an attempt to explore Freud's statement about the non-existence of time in the unconscious. However, Lacan modifies this with his proposal in 1964 that the unconscious be characterized in terms of a temporal movement of opening and closing. Retroaction and anticipation. Other forms of psychoanalysis, such as ego psychology, are based on a linear concept of time, as can be seen, for example, in their stress on a linear sequence of developmental stages through which the child naturally passes. See development. Lacan, however, completely abandons such a linear notion of time, since in the psyche time can equally well act in reverse by retroaction and anticipation. Retroaction, French après coup. Lacan's term après coup is the term used by French analysts to translate Freud's Nachträglichkeit, which the standard edition renders deferred action. These terms refer to the way that in the psyche present events affect past events a posteriori, since the past exists in the psyche only as a set of memories which are constantly being reworked and reinterpreted in the light of present experience. What concerns psychoanalysis is not a real past sequence of events in themselves, but the way that these events exist now in memory and the way that the patient reports them. Thus, when Lacan argues that the aim of psychoanalytic treatment is the complete reconstitution of the subject's history, he makes it clear that what he means by the term history is not simply a real sequence of past events, but the present synthesis of the past. History is not the past. History is the past insofar as it is historicized in the present. Hence, the pregenital stages are not to be seen as real events chronologically prior to the genital stage, but as forms of demand which are projected retroactively onto the past. Lacan also shows how discourse is structured by retroaction. Only when the last word of the sentence is uttered do the initial words acquire their full meaning. See punctuation. Anticipation. If retroaction refers to the way the present affects the past, anticipation refers to the way the future affects the present. Like retroaction, anticipation marks the structure of speech. The first words of a sentence are ordered in anticipation of the words to come. In the mirror stage, the ego is constructed on the basis of the anticipation of an imagined future wholeness, which never in fact arrives. The structure of anticipation is best illustrated linguistically by the future perfect tense. Anticipation also plays an important role in the tripartite structure of logical time. The moment of concluding is arrived at in haste in anticipation of future certainty. Topology, originally called analysis situs by Leibniz, is a branch of mathematics which deals with the properties of figures in space which are preserved under all continuous deformations. These properties are those of continuity, contiguity, and delimitation. The notion of space in topology is one of topological space, which is not limited to Euclidean 2- and 3-dimensional space, nor even to spaces which can be said to have a dimension at all. Topological space thus dispenses with all references to distance, size, area, and angle, and is based only on a concept of closeness or neighborhood. Freud uses spatial metaphors to describe the psyche in the interpretations of dreams, where he cites G.T. Fechner's idea that the scene of action of dreams is different from that of waking ideational life, and proposes the concept of psychical locality. Freud is careful to explain that this concept is a purely topographical one and must not be confused with physical locality in any anatomical fashion. His first topography, usually referred to in English as the topographic system, divided the psyche into three systems: the conscious, capital C's, the preconscious, capital P C's, and the unconscious, U, capital U C's. The second topography, usually referred to in English as the structural system, divided the psyche into the three agencies of the ego, the superego, and the id. Lacan criticizes these models for not being topological enough. He argues that the diagram with which Freud had illustrated his second topology in the ego and the id led the majority of Freud's readers to forget the analysis on which it was based because of the intuitive power of the image. Lacan's interest in topology arises then because he sees it as providing a non-intuitive, purely intellectual means of expressing the concept of structure that is so important to his focus on the symbolic order. It is thus the task of Lacan's topological models to forbid imaginary capture. Unlike intuitive images in which perception eclipses structure, in Lacan's topology there is no occultation of the symbolic. Lacan argues that topology is not simply a metaphorical way of expressing the concept of structure, it is structure itself. He emphasizes that topology privileges the function of the cut, coupure, since the cut is what distinguishes a discontinuous transformation from a continuous one. Both kinds of transformation play a role in psychoanalytic treatment. As an example of a continuous transformation, Lacan refers to the Möbius strip, just as one passes from one side to the other by following the strip round continuously, so the subject can traverse the fantasy without making a mythical leap from inside to outside. As an example of a discontinuous transformation, Lacan also refers to the Möbius strip, which when cut down the middle is transformed into a single loop with very different topological properties. It now has two sides instead of one, just as the cut operates a discontinuous transformation in the Möbius strip, so an effective interpretation preferred by the analyst modifies the structure of the analysant's discourse in a radical way. while Schema L and the other schemata which are produced in the 1950s can be seen as Lacan's first incursion into topology. Topological forms only come into prominence when in the 1960s he turns his attention to the figures of the torus, the Möbius strip, Klein's bottle, and the cross cap. Later on, in the 1970s, Lacan turns his attention to the more complex area of knot theory, especially the Borromean knot. For an introduction to Lacan's use of topological figures, see Granon-Lafont. Torus. Tord. The torus is one of the figures that Lacan analyzes in his study of topology. In its simplest forms, it is a ring, a three-dimensional object formed by taking a cylinder and joining the two ends together. Figure 19. Lacan's first reference to the torus dates from 1953, but it is not until his work on topology in the 1970s that it begins to figure prominently in his work. The topology of the torus illustrates certain features of the structure of the subject. One important feature of the torus is that its center of gravity falls outside its volume, just as the center of the subject is outside himself. He is decentered, eccentric. Another property of the torus is that its peripheral exteriority and its central exteriority constitute only one single region. This illustrates the way that psychoanalysis problematizes the distinction between inside and outside. See extimité. Training, formation didactique. The English word training is used to translate two French terms used by Lacan, analyse didactique, training analysis, and formation, professional training. Training analysis, French analyse didactique. By the time Lacan began training as an analyst in the 1930s, it had become established practice in the International Psychoanalytic Association, IPA, to make a distinction between therapeutic analysis and training analysis. This distinction is still maintained by the IPA today. In the context of this distinction, the term therapeutic analysis refers to a course of analytic treatment entered into by the analysant for the purpose of treating certain symptoms, whereas the term training analysis refers exclusively to a course of analytic treatment entered into by the analysant for the purpose of training as an analyst. According to the rules governing all the societies affiliated to the IPA, all members must first undergo a training analysis before being allowed to practice as analysts. However, an analysis is only recognized as a training analysis by these societies if it is conducted by one of the few senior analysts designated as a training analyst, and if it is embarked upon purely for the purpose of training. This institutional distinction between training analysis and therapeutic analysis became one of the main objects of Lacan's criticism. While Lacan agrees with the IPA that it is absolutely necessary to undergo psychoanalytic treatment if one wants to become an analyst, he firmly disagrees with the artificial distinction drawn between therapeutic analysis and training analysis. For Lacan, there is only one form of the analytic process, irrespective of the reason for which the analysant embarks upon treatment, and the culmination of that process is not the removal of symptoms, but the passage from analysant to analyst. See end of analysis. All analyses are thus capable of producing an analyst, and all claims by institutions to say which analyses count as training and which do not are bogus, for the authorization of an analyst can only come from himself. Lacan therefore abolishes the distinction between therapeutic analysis and training analysis. All analyses are training analyses, at least potentially. There is only one kind of psychoanalysis, the training analysis. Today many Lacanians have dispensed with both the term therapeutic analysis and the term training analysis, preferring to use the term personal analysis, a term Lacan himself uses occasionally, to designate any course of analytic treatment. The training of analysts, French formation des analystes. This refers to the process by which people learn how to conduct psychoanalytic treatment, in other words, how to be analysts. For Lacan, this is not simply a process that analysts go through at the beginning of their professional life, but an ongoing process. There are two sources from which analysts learn how to conduct psychoanalytic treatment: their own experience of treatment, first as patients, then as analysts, and the experience of others, which is transmitted to them via psychoanalytic theory. Lacan insists that the most fundamental of these sources is the analyst's own experience of psychoanalytic treatment as a patient. However, this does not excuse the analyst from having to learn a lot more besides. Lacan's syllabus for the training of analysts is very extensive and includes literature, linguistics, mathematics, and history. The analyst must seek to become, as Freud was, an encyclopedia of the arts and muses. This broad curriculum is evident in Lacan's public seminar, which is filled with incursions into philosophy, topology, logic, literature, and linguistics, all of which Lacan regards as essential to the training of analysts. It is worth noting that the English term training is nuanced rather differently to the French term formation. Whereas the English term carries connotations of a formal program or a bureaucratic structure, the French term, especially in Lacan's work, connotes a process which alters the subject in the very kernel of his being and which cannot be regulated by set ritualistic procedures nor guaranteed by a printed qualification. Transference, transfer. The term transference first emerged in Freud's work as simply another term for the displacement of affect from one idea to another. Later on, however, it came to refer to the patient's relationship to the analyst as it develops in the treatment. This soon became the central meaning of the term and is the sense in which it is usually understood in psychoanalytic theory today. The use of a special term to denote the patient's relationship to the analyst is justified by the peculiar character of this relationship. Freud was first struck by the intensity of the patient's affective reactions to the doctor in Breuer's treatment of Anna O in 1882, which he argued was due to the patient transferring unconscious ideas onto the doctor. As he developed the psychoanalytic method, Freud first regarded the transference exclusively as a resistance which impedes the recall of repressed memories, an obstacle to the treatment which must be destroyed. Gradually, however, he modified his view, coming to see the transference also as a positive factor which helps the treatment to progress. The positive value of transference lies in the fact that it provides a way for the analysant's history to be confronted in the immediacy of the present relationship with the analyst. In the way he relates to the analyst, the analysant inevitably repeats earlier relationships with other figures, especially those with the parents. This paradoxical nature of transference as both an obstacle to the treatment and that which drives the treatment forward perhaps helps to explain why there are so many different and opposing views of transference in psychoanalytic theory today. Lacan's thinking about transference goes through several stages. His first work to deal with the subject in any detail is an intervention on the transference, Lacan, in which he describes the transference in dialectical terms borrowed from Hegel. He criticizes ego psychology for defining the transference in terms of affects. Transference does not refer to any mysterious property of affect, and even when it reveals itself under the appearance of emotion, it only acquires meaning by virtue of the dialectical moment in which it is produced. In other words, Lacan argues that although transference often manifests itself in the guise of particularly strong affects such as love and hate, it does not consist of such emotions but in the structure of an intersubjective relationship. This structural definition of transference remains a constant theme throughout the rest of Lacan's work. He consistently locates the essence of transference in the symbolic and not in the imaginary, although it clearly has powerful imaginary effects. Later on, Lacan will remark that if transference often manifests itself under the appearance of love, it is first and foremost the love of knowledge, savoir, that is concerned. Lacan returns to the subject of the transference in the Seminar 1953-1954. This time he conceives it not in terms borrowed from Hegelian dialectics, but in terms borrowed from the anthropology of exchange. Mauss, Levi-Strauss. Transference is implicit in the speech act, which involves an exchange of signs that transforms the speaker and listener. In its essence, the efficacious transference which we're considering is quite simply the speech act. Each time a man speaks to another in an authentic and full manner, there is, in the true sense, transference, symbolic transference, something which takes place which changes the nature of the two beings present. In the seminar of the following year, he continues to elaborate on the symbolic nature of transference, which he identifies with the compulsion to repeat. The insistence of the symbolic determinants of the subject. This is to be distinguished from the imaginary aspect of transference, namely the affective relations of love and aggressivity. In this distinction between the symbolic and imaginary aspects of transference, Lacan provides a useful way of understanding the paradoxical function of the transference in psychoanalytic treatment. In its symbolic aspect, repetition, it helps the treatment progress by revealing the signifiers of the subject's history, while in its imaginary aspect, love and hate, it acts as a resistance. Lacan's next approach to the subject of transference is in the 8th year of his seminar, entitled simply The Transference. Here he uses Plato's Symposium to illustrate the relationship between the analysant and the analyst. Alcibiades compares Socrates to a plain box which encloses a precious object, agalma. Just as Alcibiades attributes a hidden treasure to Socrates, so the analysant sees his object of desire in the analyst. See objet petit a. In 1964, Lacan articulates the concept of transference with his concept of the subject supposed to know, which remains central to Lacan's view of the transference from then on. Indeed, it is this view of the transference which has come to be seen as Lacan's most complete attempt to theorize the matter. According to this view, transference is the attribution of knowledge to the big other, the supposition that the big other is a subject who knows. As soon as the subject who is supposed to know exists somewhere, there is transference. Although the existence of the transference is a necessary condition of psychoanalytic treatment, it is not sufficient in itself. It is also necessary that the analysts deal with the transference in a unique way. It is this that differentiates psychoanalysis from suggestion. Although both are based on the transference, psychoanalysis differs from suggestion because the analyst refuses to use the power given to him by the transference. From quite early on in the history of psychoanalysis, it became common to distinguish between those aspects of the patient's relationship to the analyst which were adapted to reality and those which were not. In the latter category fell all the patient's reactions which were caused by perceiving the analyst in a distorted way. Some analysts used the term transference to refer to all aspects of the analysant's relationship to the analyst, in which case they distinguished the distorted neurotic transference or transference neurosis from the unobjectionable part of the transference or therapeutic alliance. Edward Bibring, Elizabeth Zestel. Other analysts argued that the term transference should be restricted to the unrealistic or irrational reactions of the analysant. William Silverberg, Franz Alexander. However, the common assumption underlying both of these positions was that the analyst could tell when the patient was not reacting to him on the basis of who he really was, but rather on the basis of previous relationships with other people. The analyst was credited with this ability because he was supposed to be better adapted to reality than the patient. Informed by his own correct perception of reality, the analyst could offer transference interpretations, that is, he could point out the discrepancy between the real situation and the irrational way that the patient was reacting to it. It was argued that such transference interpretations helped the analysant to gain insight into his own neurotic transference and thereby resolve it or liquidate it. Some of Lacan's most incisive criticisms are directed at his way of representing psychoanalytic treatment. These criticisms are based on the following arguments. 1. The whole idea of adaptation to reality is based on a naive empiricist epistemology involving an appeal to an unproblematic notion of reality as an objective and self-evident given. This entirely neglects what psychoanalysis has discovered about the construction of reality by the ego on the basis of its own méconnaissance. Hence, when the analyst assumes that he is better adapted to reality than the patient, he has no other recourse than to fall back on his own ego, since this is the only bit of reality he knows. The healthy part of the patient's ego is then defined simply as the part that thinks as we do. This reduces psychoanalytic treatment to a form of suggestion in which the analyst simply imposes his own idea of reality on the analysand. Thus, the inability of the analyst to sustain a praxis in an authentic manner results, as is usually the case with mankind, in the exercise of power. 2. The idea that the analysand's distorted perception of the analyst could be liquidated by means of interpretations is a logical fallacy, since the transference is interpreted on the basis of and with the instrument of the transference itself. In other words, there is no meta-language of the transference, no vantage point outside the transference from which the analyst could offer an interpretation, since any interpretation he offers will be received as coming from the person that the transference imputes him to be. Thus, it is contradictory to claim that the transference can be dissolved by means of an interpretation when it is the transference itself which conditions the analysand's acceptance of that interpretation. The emergence of the subject from the transference is thus postponed ad infinitum. Does this mean that Lacanian analysts never interpreted transference? Certainly not. Lacan affirms that it is natural to interpret the transference, but at the same time he harbors no illusions about the power of such interpretations to dissolve the transference. Like any other interpretation, the analyst must use all his art in deciding if and when to interpret the transference, and above all, must avoid gearing his interpretations exclusively to interpreting the transference. He must also know exactly what he is seeking to achieve by such an interpretation, not to rectify the patient's relationship to reality, but to maintain the analytic dialogue. What does it mean to interpret the transference? Nothing else than to fill the void of this deadlock with a lure. But while it may be deceptive, this lure serves a purpose by setting off the whole process again. When describing the transference as positive or negative, Lacan takes two different approaches. Following Freud, Lacan sometimes uses these adjectives to refer to the nature of the affects. Positive transference referring to loving affects, and negative transference referring to aggressive affects. Sometimes, however, Lacan takes the terms positive and negative to refer to the favorable or unfavorable effects of the transference on the treatment, where Lacan argues that when the analysand's resistance opposes suggestion, this resistance must be placed in the ranks of the positive transference on the grounds that it maintains the direction of the analysis. Although Lacan does speak occasionally of counter-transference, he generally prefers not to use this term. Transitivism. Transitivism, a phenomenon first discovered by Charlotte Bühler, refers to a special kind of identification often observed in the behavior of small children. For example, a child can hit another child of the same age on the left side of his face and then touch the right side of his own face and cry in imagined pain. For Lacan, transitivism illustrates the confusion of ego and other, which is inherent in imaginary identification. The inversion right to left is further evidence of the function of the mirror. Transitivism is also evident in paranoia, in which attack and counterattack are bound together in an absolute equivalence. Treatment, cure. The term treatment designates the practice of psychoanalysis as opposed to the theory of psychoanalysis. Although the term was inherited by psychoanalysis from medicine, it has acquired a specific meaning in Lacanian psychoanalytic theory, which is quite different from the way it is understood in medicine. In particular, the aim of psychoanalytic treatment is not seen by Lacan as healing or curing people in the sense of producing a perfectly healthy psyche. The clinical structures of neurosis, psychosis, and perversion are seen as essentially incurable, and the aim of analytic treatment is simply to lead the analysand to articulate his truth. Lacan argues that the treatment is a process with a definite direction, a structural progression with a beginning, middle, and end. See end of analysis. The beginning or point of entry into the analytic situation is a contract or pact between analyst and analysand, which includes the analysand's agreement to abide by the fundamental rule. Following the initial consultation, a series of face-to-face preliminary interviews take place. These preliminary interviews have several aims. Firstly, they enable a properly psychoanalytic symptom to be constituted in place of the vague collection of complaints often brought by the patients. Secondly, they allow time for the transference to develop. Thirdly, they permit the analyst to ascertain whether or not there is really a demand for psychoanalysis and also to hypothesize about the clinical structure of the analysand. After the preliminary interviews, the treatment is no longer conducted face-to-face, but with the analysand reclining on a couch while the analyst sits behind him. Out of the analysand's field of vision, the couch is not used in the treatment of psychotic patients. As he free associates, the analysand works through the signifiers that have determined him in his history and is driven by the very process of speech itself to articulate something of his desire. This is a dynamic process which involves a conflict between a force which drives the treatment on, see transference desire of the analyst, and an opposing force which blocks the process, see resistance. The analyst's task is to direct this process, not to direct the patient, and to get the process going again when it gets stuck. Truth, vérité. Truth is one of the most central and yet most complex terms in Lacan's discourse. A few basic points are clear and constant in Lacan's concept of truth. Truth always refers to truth about desire, and the aim of psychoanalytic treatment is to lead the analysand to articulate this truth. Truth does not await in some preformed state of fullness to be revealed to the analysand by the analyst. On the contrary, it is gradually constructed in the dialectical movement of the treatment itself. Lacan argues, in opposition to the traditions of classical philosophy, that truth is not beautiful and that it is not necessarily beneficial to learn the truth. While Lacan always speaks about truth in the singular, this is not a single universal truth, but an absolutely particular truth, unique to each subject. However, beyond these few simple points, it is impossible to give a univocal definition of the way Lacan uses the term, since it functions in multiple contexts simultaneously, in opposition to a wide variety of terms. All that will be attempted here, therefore, is a general indication of some of the contexts in which it functions. Truth versus exactitude. Exactitude is a question of introducing measurements into the real, and constitutes the aim of the exact sciences. Truth, however, concerns desire, which is not a matter for the exact sciences, but for the sciences of subjectivity. Therefore, truth is only a meaningful concept in the context of language. It is with the appearance of language that the dimension of truth emerges. Psychoanalytic treatment is based on the fundamental premise that speech is the only means of revealing the truth about desire. Truth hollows its way into the real thanks to the dimension of speech. There is neither true nor false prior to speech. Truth and science. From Lacan's earliest writings, the term truth has metaphysical, even mystical nuances which problematize any attempt to articulate truth and science. It is not that Lacan denies that science aims to know the truth, but simply that science cannot claim to monopolize truth as its exclusive property. Lacan later argues that science is in fact based on a foreclosure of the concept of truth as cause. The concept of truth is essential for understanding madness, and modern science renders madness meaningless by ignoring the concept of truth. Truth, lies, and deception. Truth is intimately connected with deception, since lies can often reveal the truth about desire more eloquently than honest statements. Deception and lies are not the opposite of truth. On the contrary, they are inscribed in the text of truth. The analyst's role is to reveal the truth inscribed in the deception of the analysand's speech, although the analysand may in effect be saying to the analyst, "I am deceiving you." The analyst says to the analysand, "In this I am deceiving to you. What you are sending as message is what I express to you, and in doing so you are telling the truth." Truth versus false appearances. The false appearances presented by the analysand are not merely obstacles that the analyst must expose and discard in order to discover the truth. On the contrary, the analyst must take them into account. See semblance. Truth, error, and mistakes. Psychoanalysis has shown that the truth about desire is often revealed by mistakes. Parapraxis. See act. The complex relations between truth, mistake, error, and deception are evoked by Lacan in a typically elusive phrase when he describes the structuration of speech in search of truth as error taking flight in deception and recaptured by mistake. Truth and fiction. Lacan does not use the term fiction in the sense of a falsehood, but in the sense of a scientific construct. Lacan takes his cue here from Bentham. Thus Lacan's term fiction corresponds to Freud's term convention, and has more in common with truth than falsehood. Indeed, Lacan states that truth is structured like a fiction. Truth and the real. The opposition which Lacan draws between truth and the real dates back to his pre-war writings and is taken up at various points. We are used to the real, the truth we repress. However, Lacan points out that truth is similar to the real. It is impossible to articulate the whole truth, and precisely because of this impossibility, truth aspires to the real.